Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. Welcome to ANA's webinar, Taking Advantage of Opportunity Zones, presented by ANA's Eastern Region Training and Technical Assistance Center, as part of the Administration for Native Americans bi-monthly webinar series. My name is Dawn David, and I will be your host for today's webinar. I am the training specialist for the Eastern region, and I have been for the past 7 or so years, and I'm Mohawk from the Akwesasne Territory. To begin, let's start out with a little bit about ANA. ANA is the Administration for Native Americans, was established in 1975 to serve all Native Americans, including federally recognized tribes, American Indian and Alaska Native organizations, Native Hawaiian organizations, and Native populations throughout the Pacific Basin, including American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. ANA's mission is to promote self-sufficiency for Native Americans by providing discretionary grant funding for community-based projects, training, and technical assistance to eligible tribes and Native organizations. To achieve the goal of self-sufficiency and cultural preservation, ANA projects are planned, designed, and implemented by Native American community members to address the particular needs of their society. ANA subscribes to the philosophy that sustainable change must originate within the community. For today's webinar, we have the following learning objectives. First, our guest speaker will provide an overview of opportunity zones, which will include the creation and the designation process. Second, we will review how opportunity zones will work, the benefits and the potential opportunities in relation to Indian country, with specific information on tribal governments and Indian trust lands. And third, we will open up the discussion for a question and answer session. Okay, before we begin, a little housekeeping. I'd like to let everyone know that the materials are available for you under the handout section in the GoToWebinar control panel. PDF versions of the primer entitled Opportunity Zones in Indian Country, as well as a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, can be downloaded from there. Also, if you have questions for our guest speaker, you can enter it at any time during the presentation in the questions section of the control panel, and it will be addressed during the question and answer session later in our webinar. For those of you that have joined us later, and for everybody else, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for you to enjoy in your leisure time in about 2 weeks. It'll be available on the ANA website and as well as the Eastern Region's website, and there'll be more about that at the end. Okay. All right, so let's begin. Let me introduce to you our featured speaker for the webinar, Jonathan Dam. Jonathan began his practice in federal Indian law in 2007 at the Department of the Interior, Office of the Solicitor, Division of Indian Affairs. In 2010, John moved to the IRS, Office of Indian Tribal Governments, and at the IRS, he was involved with all tribal taxation issues. In 2019, John returned to the Division of Indian Affairs at the Interior. John graduated from Vermont Law School. In his spare time, he loves to spend time with his family and enjoys playing and coaching the creator's game, lacrosse. And I'm going to hand it over to you shortly, John.
Okay. I believe it's been handed over to me now, and I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me. Dawn, I can no longer hear you. So when you handed it over to me, I'm going to assume that I have full control. If maybe someone can say something in the chat room that they could hear me, that might help, just so I can be certain that everyone can hear me. And with that, I will go on. Okay, so thank you, Dawn, for that introduction, and it's a real honor to be here today to talk about opportunity zones before the ANA, and I wanted to thank you for the introduction. I've been with the Department of the Interior, Office of the Solicitor since March, and it's a nice opportunity, no pun intended, to talk about opportunity zones, because prior to coming to Interior, I worked at the IRS, and we worked on, I was in a small office, Office of Indian Tribal Governments at the IRS, but we focused pretty much on all tribal tax issues, and that was my sole area of practice. And towards the end of my time at the IRS, the Congress passed this opportunity zone legislation as part of the Tax Act in late 2017. And so since coming back to Interior, and with my background in tax and specifically opportunity zones, I've had an opportunity to share about them both within the department and also to help the department understand the legislation, and also in front of the federal bar in DC, and then now for you here with the ANA. I would start by talking specifically about what is an opportunity zone. And some of you may or may not be familiar with them, but it's kind of a misnomer to say it's an opportunity zone, because I think the hope is that it will become an opportunity zone. But really, these are areas, geographic areas throughout the country that are really in need of an economic or infusion of capital to help with growth and economic development. And it's typically an economically distressed area or a distressed community where that are eligible, and the eligibility requirements come from the actual legislation, which is in 26 USC 1400Z-1, and that's the legislation itself is actually kind of short. The regulations where are actually very long. And right now, the IRS is still in the process of publishing the regulations, so this is still early, and they've been through 2 rounds of proposed regulations, and they're still trying to finalize the regulations. But we do know a lot about where this is headed, and that's what I'll go over today. And as I mentioned before, that legislation was passed as part of the Tax Cut Act, and the Opportunity Zone part of it, it was actually passed from an earlier House bill that had a lot of broad bipartisan support. So there were Republican and Democratic Congress people and senators that are all promoting this on both sides of the aisle, because there's a hope that this can really make a difference. And there are over 8,000 opportunity zones spread throughout the 50 states and territories. And generally, the way it works is it's a vehicle to attract investments from outside private investors into an opportunity zone, which we'll talk more about, both what it is and how it's done going forward. But in a nutshell, the whole thing is geared towards trying to get individual investors to infuse money into these geographic areas that have a great need. And it's done through incentivizations, through tax incentives, and essentially postponing realized capital gains, and then also offering incentives for further tax exemptions on those capital gains and future profits too. And we'll talk more about that. So going back a little further, we may want to know, well, how did these eligible low-income areas actually become opportunity zones? And in 2018, shortly after the passage of the tax law, the IRS identified some three major criteria, which are on these bullet points here on the slide. And these are kind of just a framework for the governors or executives of territories to use in selecting the criteria, the actual opportunity zones. So, for example, the poverty rate of the tract has to be at least 20%, and there's some requirements about median family income in the area and whatnot. But other than that, there wasn't really that much to limit what the governors did in selecting. But they didn't have much time, because they only had about 30 to 90 days before the selections were to be made. And the IRS turned it over. It's a nominating process that the IRS turned over to the states and territories. And based with those criteria that I just mentioned, the opportunity zones were selected. The governors, each governor followed their own process for deciding what areas to nominate and to designate. And as we'll see going forward, for Indian country in particular, in some states this worked out well. In some states it did not, unfortunately. I use Montana here as an example, where the governor nominated 25 areas for designation after reviewing some proposals for eligible communities, including 7 federally recognized American Indian reservations. And I'll show you a map in a little bit here, which can kind of give you a visualization of how it worked out. But there are areas in Indian country that have been designated as opportunity zones. And if you're interested in the full list of what the designated opportunity zones is, it's all available online in spreadsheet format on the Treasury website. A quick Google, it's pretty easy to find. And we just reviewed about the opportunity zones and how they're designated, and I mentioned that some were in fact designated in Indian country, and to be precise, about 362 opportunity zones overlap the tribal lands. So that includes Alaska Native villages and reservations and tribal areas in Oklahoma. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, that not all eligible areas in Indian country did become designated. And once a designation is made, it lasts for 10 years. Now, here's that map that I mentioned before. And as you can see, the gold and yellow outlined areas are Indian reservations and Oklahoma tribal areas. The black dots in Alaska are Alaska Native entities. And then the blue shaded areas are opportunity zones that were created and designated by the various governors in the states. And as you can see, there's blue and gold designated areas, and in some places they overlap. And the map provides you a good designation, good visualization of where they overlap. For example, you could see in both Wyoming and Montana, There's some overlap. If you look at South Dakota, there isn't as much overlap as you would like to see, so that could kind of give you a visualization of where there's going to be opportunity for tribes to use this tax incentive. So before we talk more about what the incentive is, let's talk about how it works. And in order to invest in an actual, there's two parts to investing in the opportunity zone. And the first part is creating an opportunity fund. This is where the money is going to be pooled. The investment money is going to be pooled before invested in the geographic area. And there's some rules that apply to that. And only partnerships and corporations organized in one of the 50 states or District of Columbia or U.S. territory is eligible to be an opportunity zone fund. So typically, it's corporate organizations, either partnerships or corporations will be eligible. And in terms of how an opportunity fund manages its assets, it must hold at least 90% of the assets in opportunity zone property or businesses, which we'll talk more about later. But so the takeaway here is that the first step in opportunity zone process is that a fund has to be created, and it's typically a partnership or a corporation. And what kind of assets can be invested in a fund? Well, capital gains are what's invested in the fund. So an investor can't just take any asset. It has to be the capital gains from the sale of typically a real estate or a business or stock, and the seller can then has 180 days to reinvest the capital gain from the sale of that business, real estate, or stock into an opportunity zone fund in order to qualify and receive the benefits, which we'll talk more about. So for basic example, if a stock or business or real estate is sold for $400,000 and $200,000 of that was a gain to the seller, that $200,000 can be invested in an opportunity fund. And there are no limits to that. So I use this as an example, but if it was $1 million capital gain, $1 million could be invested. And the fund itself can hold much more than that. This is just from one investor, so it has to be a capital gain. So as the IRS was going through its proposed rulemaking process, after the first round of proposed rules in October of 18, there were some questions. The tribal community had some questions about how the rules can be made better to help benefit Indian country. And one of those questions that came up was, well, you had mentioned state chartered partnerships and corporations. Well, what about tribal corporations? Corporations chartered under tribal law, not state law. So it was not clear based on the regulations. And after the second round of the proposed regulations, that were published in May of this year, the IRS clarified that, and they said that indeed a tribal corporation would be able to be an opportunity zone fund. So a tribe a tribe could set up an opportunity zone fund could be set up under tribal law, and it would qualify as an opportunity fund. So that's actually is good, because that for tribes that have the capacity and the ability and the interest, there's an opportunity, a chance to gain some control over the process, because the opportunity fund has a lot of control over where the money is invested. So now the only caveat to that is that, and the IRS is clear that if it is organized under tribal law, that tribal corporation or the opportunity fund, for purposes of the opportunity fund legislation, would still be subject to federal income tax, regardless of the laws under which it is established. So if it's typically, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but tribes and a tribal government is not subject to federal income tax, and a wholly owned tribally chartered entity would typically not be subject to federal income tax. Now that the IRS is actually is interested in publishing guidance on that, just to make it a little, for there to be more certainty on that particular issue. Because although that's pretty much the way the IRS operates, because they consider tribally chartered, wholly owned tribally chartered entities as kind of arms of the tribe, and therefore not subject to income tax like the tribal government. They don't have any written guidance on that, so I think the tribal community is looking for some more certainty there. So that's something that's ongoing, and hopefully something will be published soon on that. But for purposes of opportunity funds, they will be subject to federal income tax, and that's because the way this is structured in order to incentivize investors and in order for the technical parts of this to work, they need to be subject to federal income tax. But there are tremendous tax incentives for these investors, which we'll talk about going forward a little bit here. And what can an opportunity zone invest in? So this is the next part of it. Once you have the fund, what can it invest in? And typically that it's two things: either real estate or property, real tangible property, or businesses. We'll talk about both of those things next. We'll talk about the opportunity zone business property, which means tangible property used in a trade or business. So that's the first thing. So there's some rules, some basic rules, some takeaways on that is, if the real property is acquired after December 31st, 2017, that's the first requirement. And they also require that the original use of the property commenced with the opportunity fund, or the fund substantially improves the property, and during substantially all the fund's holding period of that property, substantially all of the use of the property was in the qualified opportunity zone. And those are all there just to do whatever is possible to promote actual investment and building and in an area to help revitalize and inject capital and create jobs and economic activity in the area. There was some concern, and I think there's still concern that there might be some people that use this structure, the opportunity fund structure, to kind of park money and reap the tax benefits without really doing anything. And there's always, people looking for loopholes, et cetera. So that's why these requirements are there. It's to avoid that. And then the other So there's property that a fund can invest in, or business a fund can invest in. And just like with the property, there's some rules that are listed here in the bullets that are in place in order to help promote and make sure that the businesses actually do business inside the geographical area of the opportunity zone. And, some of them are substantially all the tangible property owned or leased in the opportunity zone. Business property is business property in the zone. So this is substantially all test again, and 50% of the gross income of a business is derived from actual activity conducted of the actual conduct of the business. And a substantial portion of the intangible property of the business is used in the active conduct of business. So again, these are all here, and it gets more complicated and deeper than this if you look at the regulations. But again, they're here to make sure that the businesses are actually doing business in the zone. Now there are some things that the business, this is for the opportunity zone businesses, there are some things that they can't be, and here's a list of them, and these are right in I believe the statute. I don't think they came from the regulations, so these can't change, and they speak for themselves. Private and commercial golf courses, country clubs, massage parlors, hot tubs, suntan facilities, racetracks, and any store where the principal business is the sale of alcoholic beverages for off-site consumption. So the opportunity funds cannot invest in a opportunity zone business that does these things, and that's just the way that's going to be. So that's pretty much written into law. But excluding that, there's lots of a diverse array of businesses that can then do business in a zone. Now that said, for example, this doesn't say, it says racetracks or other facilities used for gambling, but that doesn't mean a hotel can't be built adjacent or close to a casino. So that wouldn't be excluded under this, but the actual building where gambling or gaming is taking place would be excluded. So another thing, I mentioned earlier that there were some questions that came up in the first round of rulemaking regarding whether or not tribes can charter funds under tribal law. And then this was another issue that came up regarding the unique aspect of tribal land is that it's often trust land, so which involves leasing. So the question was, will Indian trust land qualify as opportunity zone business property? And the first round of regulations were unclear on this, but the second round of proposed regulations made it very clear that yes, indeed, the IRS will allow trust land and to be qualified as business zone property, and as long as the lease associated on that trust land was acquired under a lease after December 31st, 2017. That's similar to the purchase rule for property, and substantially all the use of the lease property is in business zone. Again, these are just some rules to require that to ensure that the investment is going on in the zone. But there's some differences. So unlike the tangible property requirements, the proposed regulations will not impose that original use requirement on leased property, because in a lot of circumstances, leased property cannot be placed in service or depreciated or amortization purposes, as the leasee does not own the leased property. So the leased property, therefore, it won't be subject to this substantially improved requirement as it is for purchased property. There are some other rules that regarding related and unrelated entities on leases that apply across the board for property that won't apply on leased property. So now that we've talked about what an opportunity zone is, how they were created, and what different types of activity can take place in an opportunity zone. We know a fund is typically a corporation or a partnership, and it can be done pursuant to tribal law. And we know that there's some rules apply to the fund, and the fund mostly has to invest within an opportunity zone, and they're typically investing in either property itself or businesses. But so what's to attract an investor? And this is where the carrot approach comes into play. We know that investors would invest in the fund. They invest their capital gains, but now we're going to find out what these actual benefits are to the investors. So when you're talking to people, when you're trying to infuse economic development into an area or start a fund, the pitch to the investors is that, well, first of all, you, as an investor, any capital gain that you realize on the sale of your assets, you will not, all taxes on that capital gain will be deferred until you divest that interest in the fund, or until December 26, 2016, whichever comes first. So you do not have to, pay those capital gains right away. And then next, there's that first, it's just the deferment of capital gains. You don't have to pay taxes as you normally would. And then the second one is now you get to get some of that capital gain actually forgiven based on how long you keep your money invested in an opportunity fund. So for example, if an investor stays in the fund for at least 5 years, and 10% of you get 10% of a deferred capital gain on your investment, it's forgiven. So if you keep your investment in for additional 2 years, so for 7 years, then another 5% of the capital gain is forgiven off of your investment. So those are some good carrots. You're actually getting, the capital gain is actually going to have less tax on it than it originally would have. And the more money you put in, the bigger difference that makes. And then the big one also is if any profit earned on an investment in a new fund is actually going to be tax-free if you keep it in the fund for 10 years. So, let's say you took that $200,000 that we talked about before, and you invested it in an Opportunity Zone fund, and then you left it in for 10 years. Let's say that fund invested in built a hotel or a mall or something on some real estate, and that the money that was invested in that gained an additional that $200,000. When you sold it after 10 years is now $300,000. Well, that additional $100,000 wouldn't be subject to any federal taxes. So that's a big one as well. So those are the three main carrots for investors to invest in a fund. Now, turning to Indian country, what benefit would it bring? And I think I came up with a list here, but it's pretty much everything, because tribal communities would benefit from the investments where they're needed. And so these are typically some of the areas that I listed where investment in Indian country is needed: agriculture, broadband, trying to expand broadband access, education, energy development, forestry, healthcare, housing, big one obviously, infrastructure, production facilities associated with agriculture, for example, mining and mineral extraction, waste management, water treatment, you name it, anything Indian country does. There's an opportunity here to try to attract investors with this approach. Excuse me. So, turning to tribal housing, on the slide here, I just talk about some of the existing federal housing programs and loan guarantee programs and tax credit programs. But as we all know, it's never enough. So trying to excuse me, add this opportunity for private investment to actually come into the housing area is something that could be marketable. Tribal energy, again, same thing. And I put Department of Energy, for example, ran a program which is now closed that offered an opportunity to create grants for energy development, but it required a 50% cost sharing element to it. Now, this program is now closed, but it's something to keep your eye out for, because often there are programs will have these various cost sharing requirements that, where does the money come from? Well, in the past, there's been things like new market tax credits, but those have a much, those are dependent year to year, and those are have more requirements, regulations, and reporting than the opportunity zone requirements, quite frankly. So that's a key difference here, is that there's a lot less red tape involved with opportunity zones than something like new market tax credits. And something, if you keep your eye out for programs like this one here in 2018 by Department of Energy that require cost sharing, this would be a good opportunity for that. And this slide just talks a little more about that program and the 50% recipient cost share, which you can review in your own time after the presentation. But again, this one, although it was a good example, I don't believe it's still open, but it's a good example of a opportunity where this type of investment vehicle could be used in conjunction with grant and loan programs from the federal government. Tribal agriculture, another one. And specifically, I used industrial hemp production, which I know a lot of tribes are taking advantage of. But on the difficulty of raising money is often on the production side. Once you get the yield from whatever crop, well, then often tribes have to outsource production to other facilities. So this opportunity zone funds and tax incentives may be a way for tribes to bring production back into Indian country, or help it get into Indian country. And then finally, here are some statutes, regulations, rules, and other links. The actual statute itself is posted here on 26 USC 1400 Z1 and 2. It's rather short, but then if you go to the proposed opportunity zone regulations that are published in October and May, you will see they're quite lengthy, and they have there's a lot of meat to them, and they cover everything I've talked about here and much more. There is one IRS ruling, Rev ruling that has been published on this, at least one. And then I know the IRS newsroom has really good frequently asked questions on opportunity zones, which might be helpful. And the FOA, the Native American Finance Officers Association, has a really good website too. And they discuss some of those issues that I talked about earlier regarding whether tribes can make funds, and whether leases and tribal trust lands would be included in opportunity zones. I would just finish by mentioning that I do see this. This is in its infancy. As I mentioned earlier, the final regulations are not even out yet. So, but this is going to be something, while I think it really can benefit Indian country, I do think it's going to require tribes and tribal organizations working hard to attract investors, either by making a fund themselves or working with funds that exist to try to bring the investment in. I think there are socially conscious investment groups that do invest in this type of scale that we've been talking about. Then there's investors that invest in an entirely larger scale, like retirement funds and things like that. They're not necessarily. There's other tax incentives which they're often incentivized to use, but this does present an opportunity, although it's going to require a lot of work and organization on behalf of Indian country to utilize this. I don't think it's going to require some self-promotion and hard work to make it happen. But I think there are investors out there that would take advantage of this if it was done right. So with that, I will turn it back over to Dawn, and thank you very much for listening. And I can open it up to any questions now.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me? Okay,
I
people can hear me. All right. Okay, I hope you'll join me in thanking John for that amazing presentation. We're going to open up for questions now, and there are a few that are entered. I just want to remind people to enter your question in the question section in the control panel. So while people are doing that, and I hope everybody takes advantage of asking John while we have the chance, we'll begin with some questions. Okay, so the first question I saw from Margot Howard. She says, wow, this is amazing. So do you have a person that could help our nation to navigate the ins and outs of this on a personal level? I'm not sure what she means by personal level, but I understand the concept of having a resource person we can contact and ask questions.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's something that the Interior Department is really trying to wrap its head around now. I know that there are folks in the Secretary's office and the BIA. They're trying to see like how we as the government can help with this. And I think the conclusion has been doing things like I'm doing right now. But in terms of actually like building this thing from the grounds up, I think folks who are typically involved with economic development for the tribe, within the government, within the government's attorney's office, and are the ones that are going to be structuring this and building this, because it's going to be regulatorily and tax incentive. People know that tax law and structuring corporations on the corporate side will be involved with this, and then on the investment side. But in terms of, I am always more than happy to help steer anyone in the right direction. So I can be contacted at the Department of the Interior. I don't know if my contact information is up, but it's pretty easy to find me if you reach out to the solicitor's office, and I'm happy to help with that as well.
Okay. Do you possibly enter your contact information in the chat box so the audience can?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, and while he's doing that, okay, we have another question, and this one is from David Flute. Is there a process or procedure whereupon the decision makers can redesignate an opportunity zone? For example, if a municipality or a tribe was designated but are not attracting investors and or not aggressively marketing themselves for investors to consider their designated area for investment, can that designation be moved, and who has that authority?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do not believe so. I think that there was the window for designating the zones was very small. Like I said, I think it was like 90 days, and then there was an opportunity to extend that to 120 if you got an exemption to do that. And once they're designated for 10 years. So maybe in 10 years. Now, whether a rule can be created for, if I think I understand correctly, saying, well, let's say 5 years goes by and it's not working out in that zone. Can we shift that to another eligible zone? That's a good question. Not that I'm aware of, but again, maybe looking through the rules, perhaps that's there. I do not think it is. But I don't know if that would require either a change in the law and the statute, or whether that could be done through a rule. If it's not there, I'm not sure.
Okay. Alrighty. Our next question, I know we're kind of pressed for time. What if we have a project, and this is from Brian Kirk, that we are exploring for investors because our location falls under the opportunity zone? Do we speak to our state regional commerce representative?
I don't know if I think I'm not that familiar with how regional state commerce representatives work. So that I can't say for sure, but I don't think that's a requirement, if that's the question.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a requirement or not. I don't know of that being a requirement, but I know if you have a project in mind and you obviously would want to bring in as many resources as possible. So would it behoove the tribe to do that? Perhaps. I don't think there's any reason it couldn't. Again, like what my message would be to cast as large a net as possible in terms of entities and individuals in the economic development area that can help with this, because that's really what it's going to take. So I don't see why you wouldn't bring someone in that you thought could help, but I don't know if that's a requirement.
Okay, and here's a question from David Flute again. Are there any tribal leaders, lobbyists working on amendments to the codification?
I don't think any amendments are in the works right now, but I know, like, for example, that NAFOA would be a good resource. That would be a good starting point to contact. I think they've been right at the front of this for Indian country. So contacting NAFOA, and Dante Desiderio, who works there, would be a good person to speak to. They've really been at the forefront of this for Indian country, so they would be up to date with the latest issues that may have been spotted, which are trying to be addressed in the next round of rulemaking, for example.
Okay, all right, thank you. One more quick question. I'm sorry, John has to leave for some family to take care of his family, but one quick question. Can tribes collaborate, partner with non-native entities for hemp production and manufacturing to meet opportunity zone status? Are there funds available from BIA or other agencies for investment?
That is beyond my current level of expertise, outside of opportunity zones. But if you wanted to email me, I put my email in the chat box. So Dawn might be able to get that to you, but it's Jonathan, JONATHAN .DAMM, DAMM, 2 M's as in Monday, at sol.doi.gov. And I could try to steer you in the right direction for that question. But in terms of for opportunity zone funds, again, I think it's going to be something that's done outside. The government, the interior itself doesn't have any real authority to, make, grants or loans under this program, but we're doing our best to promote it and get information out there for Indian country so so folks can use it as a tool when working with investors, and is using as part of the solution in addition to other programs like New York tax credits or other grants and loans.
Okay. All right, Jonathan. I know you have to leave, and I'm really sorry. I wish we could have kept you sooner, but family comes first, right? Okay,
Yeah, no,
so
I'm happy to help, and I wish I could talk longer too.
yeah, we appreciate that you did come here and you took the time out, and I'm sure everybody appreciates that, and we'll forward some follow-up questions to Jonathan. So thank you very much, Jonathan, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and through the holidays.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and happy holidays to everybody, and thank you for having me. It was an honor. And again, if you have questions, I'm happy to help with any follow-up. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm sorry we couldn't keep him longer, but most of the questions were addressed. I think he answered some other ones once he got into speaking. So, and those that didn't, we can forward them to him, and maybe he can point you in the right direction, as he did mention. So just to finish up our webinar here, I'd like to remind everybody that we're heading into application season for ANA, and everybody's anticipating the publication of the funding opportunity announcements. We would like to remind everyone that everyone planning on applying this year, that you don't have to wait for the full publication to begin your application. The ANA framework that was introduced in 2018 is the same and will remain in the upcoming FOAs. That is the new ANA framework with the long-term community goal, the current community condition, project goal, the TTIP objectives and outcomes and outputs. That's what we call the ANA framework that will be used again this year. So we highly recommend that you start on that, start fleshing out that ANA framework. You can do that now while we wait for the FOA publications, and really get into planning your project approach. Now's a good time to begin that and start gathering the needed documentation and for community input for all your budget items that need documentation. And a special note to those that are applying for native languages, finish up that work on the status of the language assessment that's required for your application. So now's the time to be polishing those up and getting them ready for your application. In the future, we're going to look for ANA announcements for FOA publications on their website and social media, such as Facebook and Twitter, and their accounts. You can also subscribe for notifications for ANA on the grants.gov website, where you can, if you're subscribed already, you can get those notifications, and you'll be notified as soon as any no-picks come up from ANA, and then definitely when the FOAs are published. So that's one of our best practice tips. And I just want to give a shout out to our fellow TA providers. If you're new to ANA and not familiar with our TA services, regional providers conduct trainings and provide technical assistance to complete your application, including the pre-application trainings and electronic technical assistance that will give you one-on-one feedback on your draft application. And the good news is that it's all free. Once the FOAs are published, the regional TA centers will put out a calendar for the pre-application trainings. And these are very informative and very helpful to everyone that attends, where it will walk you through all the requirements of an ANA application. We'll walk you through the FOA, we'll walk you through the review criterion, how to submit, and then what happens after you submit your application, and all in an attempt to improve your scores and move more people into being fundable. So the slide here has toll-free numbers and websites, and you can contact your region and they will be more than happy to assist you. Okay, so this brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. I'd like to thank again Jonathan for attending and being that resource person for us for this Opportunity Zone webinar. And well, thank you all for attending as well. And asking those questions and learning more about that and bringing it back to our Indian communities. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for future viewing in about 2 weeks on the Eastern Region and any ANA websites. Thanks again for attending, and enjoy the holidays. Have a safe and happy holidays. Nyawa.